In suburban Chicago, a young social worker was about to face the most devastating confrontation of her life. What started as a simple family dinner took a shocking turn when she came face to face with decades of buried cruelty. Rebecca Matthews wasn't your typical grieving daughter. For 28 years, she had spent her life helping fractured families heal. Known for her ability to break through even the most hardened emotional barriers. When she encountered her father's cold dismissal of her engagement announcement, she had no idea she was walking into a generational battlefield that had claimed victims for decades. Rebecca's unexpected counterattack would lead to revelations that would either destroy their family forever or finally break the cycle of inherited trauma. What began as an announcement of joy would become a reckoning with the darkest family secrets. The Matthews household would never be the same after a daughter finally found the courage to tell her emotionally absent father the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house looked smaller than Rebecca remembered. Not physically, the two-story colonial still commanded its corner lot in Winnetka, with the same understated authority it had possessed throughout her childhood. Something fundamental had shifted. The careful landscaping that her mother Catherine had tended with such devotion seemed less vibrant. The windows darker despite the afternoon sun. Rebecca's rental car idled in the driveway as she studied the facade. David's hand found hers across the center console, his fingers warm and steady. "You okay?" His voice carried the gentle concern that had drawn her to him 3 years ago, when they'd met at a coffee shop near the community center where she worked. Even then, he'd possessed an intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to simply be present. "I will be." The words felt more like a hope than a certainty. Rebecca had spent the flight from Denver practicing what she'd say to her father, rehearsing conversations that had been decades in the making. But now, faced with the reality of returning to this house, this museum of her fractured childhood, her carefully constructed composure began to fray.
Ow.
David squeezed her hand. "We can sit here as long as you need." Through the front window, she glimpsed movement. Her father's silhouette passed behind the sheer curtains of his study. The same restless pacing she remembered from countless childhood evenings when he'd brought work home. Some patterns, it seemed, were eternal.
"No,"
she said, releasing David's hand and reaching for the door handle. "Let's get this over with." The front door opened before they reached the porch steps. Richard Matthews stood framed in the doorway, his tall frame as imposing as ever, despite the subtle signs of age, the gray threading through his dark hair, the deeper lines around his eyes. He wore a navy suit, impeccably pressed as if he were preparing for a board meeting rather than his wife's funeral. His voice carried the same measured tone she remembered from childhood, the one that made even her name sound like an agenda item. His gaze shifted to David with the calculating assessment of a man sizing up a potential business partner. "And you must be David." David stepped forward, extending his hand with the easy warmth that came naturally to him. "Mr. Matthews,
I'm
sorry for your loss." Richard's handshake was brief, professional. "Thank you. Please, come in." The interior of the house struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Everything was exactly as she remembered her mother's collection of blue and white. Porcelain still graced the dining room hutch. The antique Persian rug still covered the hardwood floors of the living room. Even the faint scent of her mother's lavender sachets lingered in the air. But Catherine's absence transformed these familiar elements into something haunting, like visiting a museum dedicated to a life suddenly and irrevocably ended. "I've had Mrs. Patterson from next door helping with the arrangements," Richard said, his tone briskly efficient. "The viewing is tomorrow at 3, funeral Wednesday at 11. I assume you'll want to say something." David glanced at Rebecca, his eyebrows raising slightly at Richard's businesslike approach to discussing his wife's funeral. Rebecca recognized the expression. David came from a large, demonstrative family where grief was shared openly, where comfort was offered through touch and presence rather than logistics. "Yes, I'd like to speak," Rebecca managed. "Mom would have wanted good. I'll let Henleys know." Richard was already moving toward his study, his attention shifting to a stack of papers on the hall table. I've taken care of the flowers, the music, the reception afterward. Everything's handled. Everything except the grieving, Rebecca thought. She watched her father retreat into the familiar fortress of productivity, the same strategy he'd employed. Throughout her childhood, whenever emotions threatened to intrude on his carefully ordered world, "Dad," she called after him, "maybe we could just talk about Mom." Richard paused, his hand on the study door. For a moment, something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or simply fatigue. But when he turned back to them, his expression had returned to its neutral mask. There'll be time for that later. Right now, there are details that need attention. His gaze moved to David again, and Rebecca caught the subtle dismissal in his tone. "I'm sure you understand, being in education. Preparation is everything." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained pleasant. "Of course." Rebecca felt the familiar knot forming in her chest. The same tightness she'd experienced countless times as a child when her father reduced her emotional needs to inconvenient interruptions in his schedule. The sensation was so immediate, so visceral, that for a moment she was 8 years old again, standing in this same hallway trying to tell him about her day at school while he shuffled through briefing papers. "I'll show David to the guest room," she said, her professional composure slipping back into place like armor. "And then maybe I'll look through some of Mom's things." Richard nodded curtly and disappeared into his study, the door closing with a soft but definitive click. David waited until they reached the stairs before speaking. "Is he always like that?" Rebecca's laugh held no humor. That was him being warm and welcoming. As they climbed to the second floor, Rebecca found herself cataloging the family photographs that lined the stairway wall. Her school pictures progressed chronologically: kindergarten through high school graduation, but Richard appeared in precious few of them. Most showed Rebecca with her mother, the two of them laughing or embracing while Richard remained conspicuously absent from the frame. The guest room was at the end of the hall, decorated in the same neutral tones her mother had favored. They set their suitcases on the bed and turned to study Rebecca's face. "You want to show me your room?" She hesitated. Her childhood bedroom was across the hall, its door closed like a sealed tomb. Gosh, no. She hadn't been inside it since leaving for college nearly a decade ago. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." David stepped closer, his hand settling gently on her shoulders. "Then we'll wait." "But Becca?" He used the nickname that only he and her mother had ever called her. "You don't have to handle this alone. I'm here for whatever you need." The kindness in his voice threatened to undo her completely. This was what her father had never understood, that sometimes what someone needed wasn't solutions or efficiency, but simply the acknowledgement that their pain mattered. "Act!" From downstairs came the sound of Richard's voice, sharp and authoritative as he spoke on the phone with someone about burial arrangements. Even in grief, he conducted himself like a CEO. Managing a crisis, all strategy, and no room for the messy, inconvenient reality of human emotion. Rebecca leaned into David's embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence. Tomorrow would bring the viewing, the ritual gathering of friends and family who would share memories of Catherine Matthews. Wednesday would bring the funeral itself, the final goodbye to the woman who had been the emotional heart of their fractured family. But tonight, Rebecca had to find the courage to confront the ghosts that lived in this house, the echoes of a little girl. Would learn that love was something you earned through achievement, rather than something freely given, in the shadow of a father who had mastered every aspect of success except the one that mattered most. Outside, the sun was setting over the manicured lawns of Winnetka, casting long shadows through the windows. The dining room felt emptier than ever, its quiet broken only by the faint clinking of cutlery against porcelain, though modest in size. The space carried the weight of Catherine's absences, if her energy still clung to the air. Rebecca sat across from her father at the old mahogany table where, for years, she had endured dinners steeped in silence. Now, David occupied her mother's chair, a subtle but jarring reminder that nothing about this household was the same, despite everything. Richard had insisted they continue with their usual evening routine, as though the ritual of a normal dinner could impose order on a life unraveling. The meal was meticulously prepared: grilled chicken breast, steamed vegetables, plain white rice. It was nutritionally balanced but completely devoid of soul, the kind of meal assembled by someone who valued efficiency over comfort, fuel over feeling. Catherine's cooking had always been full of warmth and intuition, even if unspoken. By contrast, felt like a sterile performance. The silence hung between them, weighted and deliberate. Rebecca stole glances at her father, who chewed methodically, his expression unreadable. David, ever the diplomat, tried to bridge the chasm. He made an earnest effort, commenting on the home's architectural quirks, mentioning things he'd noticed about the neighborhood, trying gently to coax something human out of Richard. But his efforts were met with the same courteous detachment Richard had always employed. Like he was managing a polite conversation with a client rather than engaging with his daughter's partner or acknowledging the man who had stood beside her at her mother's funeral. Rebecca felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, the slow burn of frustration she knew too well. She had seen this happen over and over, people reaching out, trying to connect with her father, and him withdrawing just enough to make them feel unwelcome without ever saying the words. David was trying, truly trying, and Richard couldn't even bother to meet him halfway. "The service was lovely today," David said after a beat, setting down his fork with quiet emphasis. His voice was calm, steady. Rebecca's eulogy was incredibly moving. Richard paused, his eyes not quite meeting David's. There was a momentary flicker in his jaw, the barest tightening that telegraphed discomfort. "Yes," he said, measured and clipped. "It was emotional." The word landed with the weight of disapproval. Not outright condemnation, but the same kind of subtle judgment Richard had always reserved for anything too raw, too honest. Even now, in the shadow of grief, he couldn't resist evaluating his daughter's vulnerability as a lapse in restraint. Rebecca stiffened, biting back the impulse to defend herself. Her father had taken the one moment she'd poured her heart into and reduced it to a commentary on emotional control, as if mourning her mother publicly had been a breach of etiquette. But David didn't flinch. If he noticed the veiled critique, he chose to rise above it. "A lot of people were in tears," he added, his tone gentle but firm. "I think they needed to hear what she said. It helped them remember the real Catherine, the woman they knew, not the version everyone pretends to be at funerals." Richard didn't respond right away, simply resumed eating, his gaze fixed on the plate in front of him as though the conversation hadn't even taken place. Rebecca watched him, her throat tight. It struck her, with painful clarity, how deeply ingrained this behavior was, how expertly her father retreated into surface-level order whenever the truth threatened to rise too close. Catherine had lived beside that silence for 3 decades, and now, even in death, was still being filtered through the lens of Richard's discomfort with feeling. Rebecca picked up her fork again, but her appetite was gone. Across the table, David gave her a small, knowing glance, pouring silent reassurance in a space that had long been void of it. You could tell how much Catherine meant to everyone. Yes, well. Richard reached for his water glass, a gesture that Rebecca recognized as his way of signaling the end of an uncomfortable topic. Catherine was very social. Another loaded word. In Richard's vocabulary, social was synonymous with frivolous, with time wasted on relationships that didn't advance concrete goals. Rebecca had heard him use the same tone to describe her mother's book club meetings, her volunteer work, her long phone conversations with friends who needed support. The silence stretched again, broken only by the mechanical tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of her father's emotional absence, the way it sucked energy from a room like a vacuum. She'd spent her entire childhood trying to fill that void, attempting to be interesting enough, accomplished enough, perfect enough to earn his attention. But tonight, something was different. Perhaps it was her mother's death, or Margaret's revelations about Catherine's secret struggles, or simply the presence of David, a man who loved her without conditions or qualifications. Whatever the catalyst, Rebecca felt a sudden surge of defiance against the oppressive dynamics that had defined their family for decades. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with deliberate brightness, "we have some good news to share." Richard's eyebrows raised slightly, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all evening. Rebecca reached for David's hand, drawing strength from his warm touch. David proposed 3 months ago. We're engaged. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope for something approaching normal parental reaction. Joy, excitement, questions about their plans. Instead, Richard's expression shifted into the calculating assessment she remembered from her childhood. The look he wore when evaluating potential investments. I see. His gaze moved to David with new scrutiny. What are your financial prospects, David? Teaching is adequate, I suppose, but hardly lucrative. Rebecca felt David stiffen beside her, his natural warmth colliding with Richard's cold practicality. Love what I do, David said carefully. And Rebecca and I are building a life together based on more than just financial considerations. Richard's slight smile held no warmth. Idealistic. But marriage is fundamentally an economic partnership. Emotional compatibility is fine for dating. Practical concerns become paramount when you're talking about mortgages, children, retirement. Planning. Dad, Rebecca began, but Richard wasn't finished. Rebecca has always been impractical about relationships. Emotional decisions rarely lead to sound outcomes. He cut his chicken with surgical precision, each movement deliberate and controlled. I assume you'll want a long engagement? Time to establish more stable financial footing? The dismissive tone was familiar, but something about the moment, perhaps the presence of David, who represented everything Richard failed to understand about human connection, pushed Rebecca past her breaking point. This isn't a business merger, she said, her voice rising slightly. It's about love. It's about building a family based on support and understanding and actually being present for each other. Richard's expression hardened. Family. He set down his knife and fork with deliberate precision. Rebecca, you need to understand something. You're not family material. You never have been. The words hit her like a physical blow, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Rebecca felt the air leave her lungs, felt 30 years of accumulated hurt crystallize into this single, devastating moment. David's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. His hand tightened around hers, but she barely felt it through the shock of her father's casual cruelty. What did you just say? Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Richard's face remained impassive, as if he'd commented on the weather. You're too emotional, too impractical. You make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. That's not what successful families are built on. The words echoed something deeper, something that seemed to come from a place Richard himself might not fully understand. But Rebecca heard only the final, definitive rejection of everything she was. Everything she'd tried to be for him. Something inside her snapped. Neither are you. The words came out quiet but clear, cutting through Richard's stunned silence like a blade. His composure cracked for the first time since their arrival, confusion and hurt flickering across his features before the familiar mask slammed back into place. Excuse me? Rebecca stood slowly, her hands trembling but her voice growing stronger. You heard me? If I'm not family material, neither are you. When was the last time you were emotionally present for anyone? When did you last show up for someone without calculating what you'd get in return? Rebecca David's voice held a warning, but she was beyond caring about maintaining peace. Mom spent 30 years making excuses for you, covering for your emotional absence, trying to be enough for both of us. And now she's gone, and you can't even grieve properly, because that would require actually feeling something. Richard's face had gone pale, but his voice remained controlled. I don't have to listen to this. No, Rebecca said, her own voice gaining strength. You don't. That's exactly the problem. You never listen. You never stay. You just retreat to your study and your work and pretend that taking care of business is the same thing as taking care of people. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I provided for this family. I gave you every advantage except a father. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at her for a long moment, something raw and wounded flickering behind his carefully constructed facade. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the study door closed with a definitive click. Rebecca sank back into her chair, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. David was beside her immediately, his arms enveloping her as 30 years of suppressed hurt finally found their voice in ragged sobs. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I can't believe I said that, she whispered against his shoulder. Maybe it needed to be said, David replied quietly, his hand stroking her hair. Maybe it was 20 years overdue. From down the hall came no sound. At all, just the terrible silence of a man retreating once again into the emotional fortress he'd spent a lifetime building. But this time, Rebecca realized, she wouldn't be the one trying to breach those walls. For the first time in her life, she'd told him exactly what his emotional absence had cost. That if he chose to remain isolated in his study rather than confront those truths, that was his choice to make. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another hour in a house where love had been reduced to logistics and connection, had been sacrificed for the illusion of control. Rebecca stared at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, listening to David's steady breathing beside her. The digital clock read 2:47 a.m., its red numbers casting an eerie glow in the darkness. Sleep had been impossible since their disastrous dinner, her mind replaying her father's cruel words and her own explosive response in an endless punishing loop. Beside her, David stirred. Can't sleep either? Every time I close my eyes, I hear him saying it again. Rebecca's voice was hoarse from crying. Family material, like some kind of defective product that didn't meet his specifications. David's hand found hers in the darkness. You know that's not true, do I? Rebecca sat up, drawing her knees to her chest. Sometimes I wonder if he's right. Maybe I am too emotional, too impractical. Maybe that's why I chose social work, because I understand dysfunctional families so well. Hey! David's voice was firm but gentle. Your compassion isn't a weakness. Your ability to connect with people, to help families heal, that's a gift. Don't let his inability to love properly convince you that there's something wrong with how you love. Rebecca leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his unwavering support. But even David's reassurance couldn't silence the voice in her head that wondered if her father's assessment contained some terrible kernel of truth. A soft knock at the bedroom door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Rebecca? It's Margaret. Rebecca wrapped a robe around herself and opened the door to find Margaret standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour. Her expression was kind but determined. I heard you moving around, Margaret said quietly. I thought you might be ready to look for those journals I mentioned. Sometimes the middle of the night is the only time we can face certain truths. Margaret glanced toward Richard's study, where a thin line of light still showed. Beneath the door. Besides, he's been on conference calls for the past 2 hours. Work crisis, apparently. Something about a merger falling through. Of course, Rebecca thought. Even in the aftermath of their confrontation, Richard had retreated to the familiar comfort of professional emergencies. Some patterns were apparently indestructible. David insisted on helping, though Margaret warned them that the attic access was narrow and cluttered. They climbed the pull-down stairs in single file, flashlight beams dancing across decades of accumulated family detritus. Christmas decorations dominated one-corner boxes of ornaments. Artificial garland, and the elaborate nativity set that Catherine had displayed every year despite Richard's grumbling about religious sentimentality. Behind the angel collection, Margaret said, directing her flashlight toward a stack of boxes marked in Catherine's careful handwriting. She showed me once, when she was particularly upset. Rebecca moved aside a box of ceramic angels to reveal a cedar chest she'd never seen before. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing neat stacks of composition notebooks, manila folders filled with loose papers, and several large manila envelopes sealed with tape. The top journal was dated from 5 years earlier. Rebecca opened it carefully, her mother's familiar handwriting filling the page with words that made her heart ache. Richard came home at 11 again tonight. What? Rebecca called to tell us about her promotion, and he listened for exactly 2 minutes before saying he had emails to answer. I watched her face fall through the phone, and I made the usual excuses about deadlines and pressure. But I'm tired of making excuses. I'm tired of pretending that his emotional absence is normal, that it's something we just have to accept. David read over her shoulder as Rebecca turned the pages, revealing entry after entry chronicling Catherine's growing awareness of her marriage's fundamental dysfunction. Her mother's words painted a picture of a woman slowly awakening to the reality that love alone couldn't heal someone who refused to acknowledge they were wounded. Saw Dr. Reeves again today. She asked me why I stay, and I couldn't give her a good answer. Habit, fear, the hope that he might change. But watching Rebecca struggle with relationships, seeing how she questions her own worth because she never felt truly valued by her father, I'm beginning to understand that my silence enables his emotional cruelty. By protecting him from consequences, I've made Rebecca pay the price. Rebecca's throat tightened as she read her mother's growing understanding of the family's destructive patterns. Catherine had seen what Rebecca was only beginning to comprehend, that Richard's emotional unavailability wasn't just a personal failing, but a form of learned behavior that was damaging everyone around him. Margaret handed her one of the sealed envelopes. This one is addressed to someone named Jennifer. Richard's sister, I believe. Rebecca carefully opened the envelope to find a 10-page letter in her mother's handwriting. It's dated just 3 months before her death. Dear Jennifer, I know we haven't spoken since you cut contact with Richard 8 years ago, but I need to understand what happened in your family when you were children. Richard has never talked about his father beyond acknowledging that he was difficult. But I'm beginning to suspect there's more to the story. Rebecca's engaged to a wonderful man, but I see her struggling with the same feelings of inadequacy that have plagued her entire life. She questions whether she's worthy of love, whether she's too much emotionally. And I recognize those as wounds her father inflicted through his consistent emotional absence. I think Richard learned these patterns from someone, and I'm hoping you might help me understand where they came from. I love my husband, but I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my daughter's emotional well-being to protect him from facing his own trauma. The letter continued for several pages, revealing Catherine's growing resolve to confront the family's dysfunction and her desperate desire to break the cycle before it claimed another generation. She'd been planning to reach out to Jennifer, to push Richard toward therapy, to stop enabling behaviors that were destroying the people she loved most. She never sent it, Margaret said quietly. She died 2 weeks after writing it. David found a folder marked Family History that contained old photographs and documents Margaret said Catherine had collected while researching Richard's background. The photos showed a progression that was heartbreaking in its clarity. Young Richard with bright eyes and an open smile, gradually transforming into the emotionally shuttered man they knew today. One document particularly caught Rebecca's attention. A newspaper clipping from Richard's childhood hometown, dated 35 years earlier. The headline read, "Local businessman arrested for domestic violence." And the accompanying article described charges filed against Thomas Matthews for assaulting his wife and disciplining his children with what neighbors described as excessive force. His father, Margaret explained. Catherine hired a private investigator last year. She wanted to understand what had shaped Richard into the man he became. The picture that emerged from Catherine's research was devastating in its clarity. Thomas Matthews had been a failed businessman who took his professional frustrations out on his family through emotional and physical abuse. The pattern was textbook: a man who felt powerless in the world, asserting dominance over those who couldn't fight back, creating a legacy of trauma that Richard had unknowingly passed on to his own daughter. There's more, Margaret said, handing Rebecca another envelope. Letters Catherine wrote but never sent to Richard, to you, even to herself. She was trying to work through her feelings about whether to stay in the marriage. Rebecca opened a letter addressed to her, dated just 6 weeks before Catherine's death. My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably struggling to understand our family's patterns. I want you to know that your father's inability to love properly isn't your fault, and it isn't a reflection of your worth. He learned emotional unavailability from a man who broke his spirit when he was just a child. Richard never learned how to heal from that trauma, and unfortunately, he's passed those wounds on to you. But patterns can be broken, sweetheart. You have the strength and the insight to create the kind of family you deserve, one built on emotional honesty rather than fear, on connection rather than control. Don't let his limitations define your possibilities. Rebecca's hands shook as she read her mother's final gift: permission to break free from the generational cycle of emotional dysfunction that had claimed too many years already. Catherine's words offered both explanation and absolution, helping Rebecca understand. that her father's cruelty came from a place of deep woundedness rather than inherent malice. As dawn light began filtering through the attic window, the three of them carefully repacked Catherine's hidden archive. Rebecca felt a profound shift in her understanding, not just of her parents' marriage, but of the forces that had shaped her own sense of self-worth. Her father wasn't just an emotionally distant man. He was a wounded child trapped in an adult's body, repeating patterns he'd never examined or challenged. That knowledge didn't excuse his behavior, but it provided a context that made healing possible. "What will you do with all this?" Margaret asked as they climbed down from the attic. Rebecca looked toward Richard's study, where the light still burned. "I'm going to try to understand him. Then I'm going to decide whether that understanding can lead to something better, or if I need to protect myself the way Jennifer did." The choice ahead wouldn't be simple. But at least now, she had the information she needed to make it consciously rather than reactively. Her mother's final gift wasn't just insight into their family's dysfunction, it was the roadmap for breaking free from patterns that had imprisoned them all for far too long. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 a.m., cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the Matthews house like a heavy blanket. Rebecca looked up from her mother's journals, which she'd been reading in the living room while Richard remained barricaded in his study. David was in the kitchen making coffee, his presence a steady comfort in the emotional minefield their home had become. Through the front window, Rebecca glimpsed an unfamiliar rental car in the driveway, and a woman approaching the door with confident, purposeful strides. Tall and lean, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she carried herself with an assurance that immediately reminded Rebecca of someone, though she couldn't place who. Rebecca opened the door to find herself facing a woman whose features were unmistakably Matthews, the same strong jawline, the same intelligent hazel eyes, but warmed by an openness that Richard had never possessed. "You must be Rebecca," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Pacific Northwest accent. "I'm Jennifer Cooper, your aunt." The words hit Rebecca like a revelation. She'd known her father had a sister, but Jennifer had been such a peripheral figure in their family narrative that she'd taken on an almost mythical quality, the relative who'd disappeared, whose name was mentioned only in passing, and always with a subtle undercurrent of judgment. Aunt Jennifer. Rebecca stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. We weren't expecting you." Jennifer's smile was warm, but tinged with sadness. "I know. I got Margaret's call yesterday about Catherine's death. Should have come sooner, but..." She paused, her gaze moving toward Richard's closed study door. "Well, your father and I haven't spoken in 8 years. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome." David appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the sound of voices. Jennifer studied him with open curiosity. Rebecca caught a glimpse of the woman's directness, so different from the emotional evasion that characterized her father's interactions. "This is David, my fiancé," Rebecca said. "David, this is my Aunt Jennifer, her father's sister." The infamous Jennifer, David said with a gentle smile, extending his hand. "Rebecca's mentioned you." "All bad things, I'm sure," Jennifer replied, but her tone held no bitterness. Richard was never one to appreciate family members who didn't conform to his vision of appropriate behavior. The sound of a door opening echoed from down the hall, followed by Richard's measured footsteps. He appeared in the living room doorway, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been pain before settling into his familiar mask of professional composure. "Jennifer," his voice was carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you were coming." "Hello, Richard." Jennifer's tone was equally controlled, but Rebecca caught the subtle steel beneath her calm exterior. "I came to pay my respects to Catherine. She was a good woman who deserved better." The barbed comment hit its mark. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "I see you're still as diplomatic as ever." "I've learned to say what I mean," Jennifer replied evenly. "It's liberating, actually. You should try it sometime." The tension in the room was palpable, decades of unresolved conflict crackling between the siblings like electricity. Rebecca found herself studying their interaction with professional fascination. This was what family dysfunction looked like when one party had done the work to heal, while the other remained trapped in old patterns, Jennifer said. Turning away from Richard with deliberate dismissal, "Could we talk?" "I'd like to hear about Catherine," and I have some things to share about our family that might help you understand. Well, a lot of things. Richard stepped forward, his voice sharp with warning. Jennifer, Richard, you don't get to control this conversation, Jennifer said firmly. Rebecca is an adult, and she has the right to know her family's history. All of it. Rebecca looked between her father and her aunt, seeing echoes of her own relationship with Richard and their dynamic. But where she had learned to retreat in the face of his emotional unavailability, Jennifer had clearly developed the strength to stand her ground. Like to hear what you have to say, Rebecca said, her voice stronger than she felt. They settled in the living room, Rebecca and David on the sofa, Jennifer in Catherine's favorite armchair, and Richard hovering near the doorway as if prepared to flee at any moment. The positioning felt symbolic, Jennifer comfortable in spaces. Richard treated as foreign territory. First, I want you to know that I loved your mother, Jennifer began, her attention focused entirely on Rebecca. Catherine was the kindest woman I ever met, and she tried so hard to make this family work despite. She glanced briefly at Richard. Despite significant obstacles. Jennifer. Richard's voice carried a warning tone that Rebecca recognized. From her childhood, the same tone he'd used to shut down conversations that ventured too close to emotional truth. Despite our father, Jennifer continued, ignoring Richard's discomfort. Thomas Matthews was a cruel, abusive man who destroyed his children's ability to trust, to love, to believe they were worthy of happiness. The difference is that I chose to heal from that damage. Your father chose to repeat it. Rebecca's breath caught. The newspaper clipping she'd found in her mother's research had hinted at this. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone who'd lived through it gave the words devastating weight. That's enough, Richard said, his composure finally cracking. You have no right to come here, and I have every right, Jennifer shot back, standing to face her brother. Rebecca is my niece, and she's been carrying the wounds you inflicted. Because you were too proud and too scared to face your own trauma. How many years has she spent wondering what was wrong with her, thinking she wasn't good enough to earn her father's love? Rebecca felt tears starting, not from pain, but from recognition. Someone finally understood. Someone finally saw the pattern she'd been trapped in her entire life. David reached for her hand, his touch grounding her as Jennifer continued. Our father used to tell us we were worthless, that we'd never amount to anything, that we were disappointments who didn't deserve love or respect. Sound familiar, Rebecca? The words echoed Richard's cruel assessment from dinner. You're not family material. Rebecca began to see the terrible inheritance of cruelty passed down through generations like a genetic curse, Richard learned. To protect himself by becoming successful, by achieving everything our father said he never would, but he never learned that success doesn't heal emotional wounds. It just builds higher walls around them. Jennifer's voice softened as she looked at her brother. And those walls don't just keep pain out, Richard, but they keep love out too. Richard's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, as Jennifer voiced truths he'd spent decades avoiding. You don't understand, he said quietly. You ran away. Don't know what it's like to what? To try to be enough for a man who was incapable of love? To sacrifice your own children on the altar of dysfunction because facing the truth was too scary? Jennifer's voice was sharp but not unkind. I do know, Richard. I lived it too. But I chose therapy over repetition. I chose healing over hiding. Rebecca watched her father struggle with emotions he'd spent a lifetime suppressing. For the first time since her childhood, she saw cracks in his armor, glimpses of the wounded boy he'd once been. Jennifer left because I told her the truth about our family, Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. When she tried to intervene with father, when she suggested we get help, I chose loyalty to him over protecting her. I was 16 and scared, and I made the wrong choice. You were a child, Jennifer said gently, but you're not anymore, Richard. And Rebecca shouldn't have to pay the price for wounds you refused to heal. The room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock. Rebecca felt the weight of 3 generations of dysfunction settling around them, her grandfather's cruelty, her father's emotional unavailability, and her own struggles with self-worth, all connected by invisible threads of inherited trauma. But she also felt something else, the possibility of change. Jennifer's presence proved that the cycle could be broken, that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. The question was whether Richard had the courage to follow his sister's example, or if he would remain trapped in patterns that had already cost him his wife and were threatening to cost him his daughter as well. "I've been in therapy for 15 years, Jennifer said quietly. "It took that long to undo the damage Father did, to learn that I was worthy of love, that healthy relationships were possible. But I did the work, and now I have a marriage built on mutual respect and children who know they're valued for who they are, not what they achieve." Rebecca looked at her father, seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not as the emotionally distant authority figure who had shaped her childhood, but as a wounded man who had learned to survive by shutting down the very parts of himself that might have connected him to others. The question was whether it was too late for him to learn a different way of being, or if the patterns were too deeply ingrained to change. But for the first time since her mother's death, Rebecca felt something that had been missing from their family for decades. Hope, Jennifer's. Revelation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire, acrid, lingering, impossible to ignore. Rebecca studied her father's face, watching him struggle with emotions that had been buried for decades. His carefully constructed composure had cracked, revealing glimpses of the frightened boy he'd once been. "He's still alive," Jennifer said, quietly, her words cutting through the silence. "Our father, Thomas Matthews. He's 86 now, living in a nursing home about an hour from here." Richard's face went white. "No, River Oaks Care Facility in Crystal Lake. I know because they called me last year when he had a stroke. Listed me as emergency contact since you'd never updated your information." Jennifer's voice was matter of fact, but Rebecca caught the undercurrent of pain. "They wanted to know if I'd authorize aggressive treatment." "What did you tell them?" Rebecca asked. "I told them to ask him. If he wanted to fight for more time, that was his choice. But I wouldn't make that decision for the man who spent my childhood telling me I was worthless." Richard had turned away, staring out the front window as if he could escape the conversation through sheer force of will. Rebecca recognized the gesture. It was the same retreat he'd employed throughout her childhood, whenever emotions threatened to intrude on his carefully ordered world. "I need to see him," Rebecca said, the words surprising even herself. Both Richard and Jennifer turned to stare at her. David's hand tightened around hers, a silent question in his eyes. "Rebecca, no," Richard said, his voice sharp with something. "That might have been panic. There's no point. He won't be the same man." The stroke affected his speech, his cognitive function. "But not as cruelty," Jennifer added grimly. "Trust me, that's intact. Mean is apparently a very resilient trait." Rebecca stood, pacing to the window where her father had been staring. The suburban street looked peaceful, normal houses with well-maintained lawns and families who probably ate dinner together, without emotional landmines exploding between courses. "I need to understand," she said finally. "Everything you've told me, everything Mom wrote in her journals, it all points back to him, to the source of this. It's poison that's been passed down through our family for generations. Understanding him won't heal the damage he caused," Richard said quietly. Rebecca turned to face her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the successful executive or the emotionally distant parent, but a man who had spent his entire adult life running from a truth too painful to face. "Maybe not," she said, "but it might help me understand you." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His composure cracked completely, and for a moment she saw raw vulnerability in his eyes, the same look she'd carried her entire life. The constant fear of not being enough. "You don't want to understand me," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me." Jennifer stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Richard, running from it hasn't worked. Look around you. Look at what it's cost." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking time that felt suspended between past trauma and possible healing. "I'll go with you," Jennifer said finally, addressing Rebecca. "If you're determined to do this, you shouldn't face him alone." "I'm coming too," David said immediately. Richard remained silent. But Rebecca caught the almost imperceptible shake of his head, the same gesture he'd made throughout her childhood, when she'd asked for things he couldn't give. Dad. Rebecca's voice was softer now, offering him one. More chance to be present for something that mattered. I can't, Richard said, and for the first time in her life. Rebecca heard genuine pain in his voice, rather than just dismissal. I haven't seen him since the day I left for college. I can't. I won't give him the satisfaction of seeing what he made me become. The admission was devastating in its honesty. Richard wasn't just refusing to visit his father, he was acknowledging that the man he'd become was somehow a twisted reflection of Thomas Matthews' cruelty. An hour later, Rebecca found herself in Jennifer's rental car. Driving through the Illinois countryside toward Crystal Lake, David sat in the back seat, his presence a steady comfort as they navigated winding roads that seemed to lead backward. Through time, Jennifer drove with the focused intensity of someone approaching a battlefield. I should prepare you, she said, as they turned into the nursing home parking lot. He's not. It's diminished by age or illness, the way you might expect. The stroke affected his mobility and some of his speech, but his essential nature remains intact. He's still manipulative, still cruel, still able to find the exact words that will cut deepest. River Oaks Care Facility was a modern building that tried hard to look home-like, despite its institutional purpose. The lobby smelled of disinfectant, barely masked by artificial pine scent. And Rebecca's stomach churned as they approached the reception desk. We're here to see Thomas Matthews, Jennifer said to the young woman behind the counter. Are you family? The receptionist asked, her tone professionally cheerful. His granddaughter, Rebecca replied, the words feeling strange in her mouth. She'd never thought of herself as having living grandparents. Her mother's parents had died when she was young, and Richard had always spoken of his father as if he were already dead. They were directed to the memory care wing, where residents wandered the halls with the lost expressions of people trapped between past and present. Rebecca found herself studying their faces, wondering which of them had been loving grandparents versus which had been sources of trauma for their families. Thomas Matthews sat in a wheelchair by the window of the common room, staring out at a courtyard garden with an expression of bitter concentration. Even diminished by age and illness, he commanded attention, tall and angular, with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. When he saw them approaching, his face transformed into a smile that held no warmth. Well, he said, his voice slightly slurred, but perfectly understandable. Jennifer, and who's this pretty little thing? Hello, Father, Jennifer said, her tone carefully neutral. This is Rebecca, Richard's daughter. Thomas's eyes lit up with malicious interest. Richard's girl, my granddaughter. He studied Rebecca with unsettling intensity, as if cataloging her features for future use. You look like your grandmother. She was weak too. The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Rebecca felt David step closer behind her, his presence a reminder that not all family relationships were built on manipulation and pain. I came to ask you about my father, Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. Thomas's laugh was harsh and grating. Richard, my greatest disappointment. Though I suppose that's fitting, his mother was a disappointment too. Couldn't even manage to give me more than 2 children before she ran off. Jennifer's intake of breath was sharp. She didn't run off. She died in a car accident, did she? Thomas's smile was reptilian. Or did she finally find the courage to escape? Either way left me with 2 sniveling brats who couldn't do anything right. Rebecca felt sick. This was the man who had shaped her father's understanding of family, of love, of his own worth. Every cruel word Richard had ever spoken to her suddenly made terrible sense. What did you do to them? Rebecca asked quietly. Thomas's eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride. I taught them the truth about the world, that strength matters more than feelings, that success is the only thing that counts, that most people are weak and deserve what they get. You abused them, Rebecca said, not making it a question. I disciplined them. I prepared them for reality. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspirative whisper. Your father turned out just fine, didn't he? Successful businessman, provider, responsible. Because I taught him that emotions are weakness, that caring too much makes you vulnerable, Rebecca felt pieces clicking into place her father's. Emotional distance, his inability to express love, his constant criticism disguised as preparation for a harsh world. All of it traceable back to this bitter man who had twisted love into control and caring into cruelty. "He hurt you too, didn't he?" Thomas said, studying Rebecca's face with predatory interest. Richard couldn't quite manage to be the warm, fuzzy father you wanted. Too bad, but at least he's not weak like his sister here. Jennifer's hand clenched into a fist, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not weak. I'm healthy. There's a difference. Healthy." Thomas practically spat the word. Running away, cutting contact with family, pretending you're better than your roots. That's not healthy, that's cowardice. No, Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. That's survival. It's breaking a cycle of abuse that you started, and my father continued. Thomas's expression shifted, becoming calculating and cold. Abuse? Is that what you call it? I turned to sniveling children into functional adults. Richard may be emotionally stunted, but he's successful. That's more than most people manage. He's miserable, Rebecca said flatly. He's lonely and bitter and incapable of connecting with the people who love him. Just like you. For the first time, Thomas's composure cracked slightly. Better than being weak. No, Rebecca said, standing. It's not, and the cycle stops with me. Thomas's laugh followed them as they walked away, harsh and mocking. It doesn't stop, girl. It never stops. You'll see. When life gets hard enough, when people disappoint you enough, you'll understand that strength is all that matters, just like your father learned. But as they left the nursing home, Rebecca felt something she hadn't expected. Clarity. Seeing Thomas Matthews, the source of her family's emotional dysfunction, had been like looking at a toxic root that had been poisoning the soil for generations. Understanding where the poison came from didn't neutralize it, but it made healing possible. The drive back was silent, each of them processing what they'd witnessed. But Rebecca felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried her entire life had finally been named and could therefore be set down. Her father's cruelty wasn't inherent or inevitably was learned behavior, passed down from a man who had confused strength with emotional brutality. That knowledge didn't excuse Richard's treatment of her, but it offered something more valuable. The understanding that patterns could be broken if someone had the courage to do the work. The question now was whether Richard would find that courage, or if he would remain trapped in his father's shadow for the rest of his life. The house was silent when they returned from the nursing home, but Richard's car was gone from the driveway. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of her had hoped he might be waiting, ready to hear about their visit to his father. But the empty driveway told a familiar story of avoidance and retreat. David helped Jennifer carry her overnight bag to the guest room while Rebecca wandered through the house, seeing it with new eyes after her encounter with Thomas Matthews. Every perfectly arranged surface, every carefully controlled detail suddenly seemed like evidence of her father's desperate attempt to create order in a life that had been chaotic and cruel from the beginning. The sound of a car in the driveway drew her to the front window, but instead of Richard's sedan, she saw an unfamiliar SUV pulling up behind Jennifer's rental car. A man in his early 50s emerged, tall and lean with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He moved with purpose as he approached the front door, his expression serious but not unkind. Rebecca opened the door before he could knock. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Richard Matthews. I'm Michael Harrison, his business partner." The man's voice carried genuine concern. "Is he here? He was supposed to be in a video conference 2 hours ago, and he's not answering his phone." "He's not here," Rebecca said. "I'm his daughter." "Rebecca, please, come in." Michael's expression softened as he stepped into the foyer. "I'm sorry for your loss. Catherine was a remarkable woman." Richard spoke of her often. Rebecca found herself studying Michael with curiosity. In all her years, she'd never heard her father mention having a close friend, let alone someone who seemed genuinely concerned about his well-being. Jennifer appeared from the kitchen, David close behind her. Michael's eyebrows raised slightly as Rebecca made introductions, clearly surprised to encounter Richard's estranged sister. Jennifer, he said with genuine warmth. Right, Richard showed me your picture once, years ago. You're an architect in Seattle, if I remember correctly. You have a good memory, Jennifer replied, her tone carefully neutral. How well do you know my brother? Michael settled into one of the living room chairs, his expression thoughtful. We've been business partners for 15 years, friends for almost as long, though I'm beginning to realize there's a lot about Richard's personal life that he's never shared. That sounds like him, Jennifer said dryly. Compartmentalization is one of his greatest skills. Actually, Michael said, leaning forward slightly, that's why I'm here. Richard has been different since Catherine's death, or withdrawn than usual, if that's possible. Today he missed a crucial meeting, and when I finally reached him by phone, he sounded— Michael paused, searching for the right word. Broken. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Did he say where he was? His office? But when I got there, the security guard said he'd left an hour earlier. Rebecca, I'm worried about him. I know you two have a complicated relationship, but how do you know about our relationship? Rebecca interrupted. Michael's expression was kind but direct, because I've watched Richard struggle with it for years. He talks about you constantly, your work, your achievements, your compassion for others. But he has no idea how to connect with you, and it's eating him alive. Rebecca stared at him in shock. He talks about me all the time. He's incredibly proud of you, Rebecca, but he's also terrified that he's damaged you beyond repair. Michael's voice was gentle but firm. I lost my own father 6 months ago, heart attack, sudden and devastating. But you know what my biggest regret is? Not the things we never did together, but the conversations we never had, the truths we never spoke. Jennifer leaned forward, her attention focused intently on Michael. What kind of truths? The difficult ones, about love and failure and forgiveness, about how patterns repeat themselves until someone has the courage to break them. Michael's gaze moved between Rebecca and Jennifer. Richard has never told me about his childhood, but I've worked closely enough with him to recognize the signs. He's a man running from something, and it's cost him everything that matters. He told me yesterday that I wasn't family material, Rebecca said quietly. Right after I announced my engagement. Michael's face darkened with something that might have been anger. He said, what? David spoke up for the first time. He was cruel, deliberately, calculatedly cruel. Said she was too emotional, too impractical to build a successful family. Jesus, Michael whispered. He's repeating the cycle. You know about the cycle? Jennifer asked sharply. Michael nodded slowly. I suspected. Last year, when my father was dying, I tried to talk to Richard about family, about the importance of not leaving things unsaid. He got physically uncomfortable, started talking about work deadlines. Then he said something that stuck with me. Some fathers prepare their children for the world. Others just prepare them for disappointment. Rebecca felt tears starting. Even that cryptic comment revealed more emotional vulnerability than her father had shown her in 30 years. Where do you think he went? David asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment. There's a bar he sometimes mentions. O'Malley's down on Lincoln Avenue. It's the kind of place where a man can sit alone and drink without anyone bothering him. Rebecca stood immediately. I need to find him. Rebecca. Wait, Jennifer said. Are you sure that's wise? He might not be ready for— I don't care if he's ready, Rebecca said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm tired of waiting for him to be ready. 30 years is long enough. Michael stood as well. I'm coming with you. Richard and I have some things to discuss. O'Malley's was exactly what Rebecca had expected, a dimly lit establishment with worn wooden floors and the kind of anonymous atmosphere that attracted people seeking solitude rather than company. She spotted her father immediately, sitting alone at the far end of the bar with a half-empty whiskey glass in front of him. Richard looked up as they approached, his expression cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been relief. His tie was loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held a hollow quality Rebecca had never seen before. Michael, he said quietly, I suppose you're here about the Hartwell account. No, Richard. I'm here about you. Michael took the bar stool next to him while Rebecca remained standing, unsure of her welcome. About the fact that you're drinking. Alone in a dive bar instead of dealing with what's happening in your life? Richard's laugh was bitter. And what exactly is happening in my life, Michael? My wife is dead, my daughter hates me, and I just spent the afternoon driving around trying to find the courage to visit my father in his nursing home. Courage I apparently don't possess. Rebecca's breath caught. You know about Grandpa Thomas? Richard turned to look at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived. I've always known. I've known for 20 years where he was, what kind of shape he was in, and I've been too much of a coward to face him. Richard, Michael said gently, tell me about your father. For a moment, Rebecca thought Richard would retreat into his usual pattern of deflection and avoidance. But something in Michael's tone, not judgment but genuine concerns, seemed to crack through his defenses. He was a monster, Richard said simply. He turned love into pain and family into warfare. And despite everything I've done to be different from him, I've somehow managed to become exactly what he was, Rebecca said firmly. You're not him. Richard's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. Aren't I? Yesterday I told my daughter she wasn't family material. Those could have been his words coming out of my mouth. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Rebecca felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Her father wasn't just emotionally distant, was actively fighting against becoming his father, while simultaneously proving unable to escape the patterns Thomas had imprinted on him. The difference, Rebecca said quietly, is that you can recognize it. He couldn't. He thought his cruelty was strength. You know it's damage. Richard looked at her with something approaching hope. Is that enough? Is recognition enough to break? Patterns that have been decades in the making? I don't know, Rebecca said honestly. But it's a start. Michael placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. Richard, I've watched you build a successful business through intelligence and determination. You've never backed down from a challenge when it mattered. But you're acting like emotional healing is impossible, like you're doomed to repeat your father's mistakes? Maybe I am, Richard said quietly. Or maybe, Rebecca said, sitting on the stool on his other side. You just need to stop running from the work and start doing it. Richard turned to study her face, and for the first time in her memory, she saw him really seeing her not as an extension of his own success or failure, but as a separate person with her own strength and wisdom. I don't know how, he admitted. And the vulnerability in his voice was staggering. Therapy, Michael said immediately. Professional help. Same way you'd handle any other problem that was beyond your expertise. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the bar mirror. And if it's too late, I've already damaged Rebecca beyond repair. Rebecca felt tears starting, but her voice was steady. Then we'll deal with that too. But Dad, the damage isn't beyond repair unless you decide it is. The word Dad seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. Rebecca realized she hadn't called him that in years, had defaulted to the safer distance of Richard, or simply avoiding. Direct address altogether. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and the words seemed to come from someplace deep and rarely accessed. For yesterday, for your childhood, for becoming someone you couldn't love. I never stopped loving you, Rebecca said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. I just stopped expecting you to love me back. Richard's composure finally cracked completely. For the first time in her memory, Rebecca saw her father cry, not the controlled tear of someone maintaining dignity, but the raw grief of someone finally confronting decades of accumulated loss. Michael quietly paid their tab, while Rebecca and Richard sat in silence. 30 years of unspoken pain finally acknowledged between them. The work ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since her mother's death, Rebecca felt something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. The drive home from O'Malley's was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the tense avoidance that had characterized their interactions since Rebecca's arrival. Richard rode in the passenger seat of Michael's SUV while Rebecca and David followed in their rental car. The wait between them felt less like distance and more like gathering storm clouds before a cleansing rain. Michael declined Rebecca's invitation to come inside, sensing that the family needed space for whatever was about to unfold. Call me if you need anything, he said to Richard, clasping his friend's shoulder with genuine affection. And Richard, don't run from this. Not again. Inside the house, Jennifer was waiting in the living room with a pot of coffee and the careful alertness of someone who understood that significant conversations required both caffeine and courage. She took one look at Richard's red-rimmed eyes and Rebecca's determined expression and quietly withdrew to the kitchen, giving them space while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. David settled into the corner armchair, his presence steady but unobtrusive. Over the past few days, he'd learned to read the Matthews family dynamics well enough to know when to speak and when to simply witness. Richard stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture Rebecca recognized from childhood's a stance he assumed when preparing to deliver difficult news or uncomfortable truths. But something was different now, the rigid control that usually characterized. His bearing had been replaced by something more fragile, more human. "I need to tell you about your grandfather," Richard said finally, his voice quiet but clear, "about what he did to Jennifer and me, and how I've spent my entire adult life trying not to become him while somehow managing to do exactly that." Rebecca curled into the corner of the sofa, drawing her knees up in a gesture that made her look younger than her 28 years. "I saw him today. Jennifer took me to the nursing home." Richard's face went pale. "You saw him? You actually spoke to him?" "He's exactly what you'd expect," Rebecca said. "Cruel, manipulative, unrepentant. He seemed almost proud of the damage he'd done." Richard closed his eyes briefly as if trying to shut out memories that had been threatening to surface for decades. He was proud. He thought breaking us down was the same as building us up. He called it preparation for the real world. "Tell me," Rebecca said gently. "Tell me what he did." Richard moved to the window, staring out at the darkening street. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were narrating someone else's story. "He never hit us where anyone could see the bruises. He was too smart for that, too concerned about his reputation in the community." But behind closed doors, Richard's hands clenched at his sides. "He had this way of making you feel like you deserved whatever happened to you, like his anger was your fault for being disappointing, for not living up to his standards." Rebecca felt sick, imagining her father as a child, enduring the kind of systematic emotional abuse that left scars invisible to the outside world. "He used to line us up for inspection every morning before school," Richard continued. "Our clothes, our posture, our expressions, everything had to meet his approval. If something was wrong, if we failed his test in any way, he'd make us late for school while he corrected the problem, and he'd write notes to our teachers explaining that. We'd been irresponsible about our morning routine." "Jesus," David whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop himself. Richard glanced at him briefly before continuing. He was systematic about it. Never enough to trigger outside intervention, but constant enough to make us understand. That love was conditional, that approval had to be earned through perfection, and that any display of emotion was weakness that would be punished. Rebecca thought about her own childhood, about the countless times she'd tried to earn her father's attention through achievement, through being the perfect daughter who never caused trouble or demanded too much emotional energy. The pattern was heartbreakingly clear now. "When did it stop?" she asked. "It didn't," Richard said simply. "It just became internalized. By the time I left for college, I'd learned to do his job for him. I didn't need him to tell me I wasn't good enough. I knew it in my bones." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock. Rebecca felt the pieces of her father's psychology clicking into place with devastating clarity. His emotional distance, his inability to express affection, his reduction of relationships to practical transactions. All of it was armor against the kind of vulnerability that had been weaponized against him as a child. "Why didn't you get help?" Rebecca asked. "Why didn't you try to heal from it?" Richard turned from the window to face her directly. "Because I thought I had healed. I thought that by becoming successful, by providing for my family, by never raising my hand to you, I thought that was enough. I thought that by not being physically abusive, I was breaking the cycle." "But you were emotionally abusive," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. "Maybe not intentionally, maybe not with the same malice he showed, but the effect was the same. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn your love, wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't make you proud." Richard's face crumpled. "I was proud. I am proud. You're everything I could never be: compassionate, emotionally intelligent, capable of real connection with people. But I didn't know how to tell you that without feeling like I was lying. Because someone like me doesn't deserve to have a daughter like you." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Rebecca felt 30 years of accumulated hurt beginning to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something more complex: grief for the relationship they'd never had. Anger at the time that had been lost, but also a fragile beginning of understanding. "You do deserve it," she said quietly. "You deserve to have people love you, Dad, but you have to stop pushing them away when they try." "I don't know how," Richard said, and the naked vulnerability in his voice was staggering. "I've spent so many years keeping people at arm's length that I don't remember how to let them close." Rebecca stood, moving toward her father with careful deliberation. "Start here. Start now. Start with telling me one thing you've never said before." Richard looked at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through fear, hope, and something that might have been wonder. "I love you," he said finally, his voice breaking on the words. "I have always loved you, from the moment you were born. But I was so terrified of failing you the way my father failed me that I failed you anyway, just in a different direction." The words Rebecca had waited 30 years to hear finally filled the space between them. Not perfect, not without conditions, but real and present and achingly human. "I love you too," she whispered, and for the first time since childhood, she stepped into her father's embrace. Richard's arms came around her tentatively at first, then with increasing certainty, as if he were remembering something he'd forgotten how to do. Rebecca felt his tears against her hair and realized that her own face was wet. They stood like that for several minutes, holding each other while decades of misconnection finally found expression. David wiped his own eyes, and from the kitchen came the soft sound of Jennifer crying for the brother she'd thought was lost to their father's poison forever. When they finally separated, Rebecca looked into her father's face and saw something new. They're not the perfect composure he'd maintained for years, but something more valuable: authenticity. The mask he'd worn to protect himself from his father's cruelty had finally cracked, revealing the wounded but loving man underneath. "This doesn't fix everything," Rebecca said gently. "There's still a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild." "I know," Richard said, "but for the first time in my life, I want to do that work. I want to learn how to be the father you deserve to have." Rebecca smiled through her tears. "You're not too late, Dad. Damage doesn't mean broken. Broken doesn't mean unfixable." Richard nodded, his expression holding a tentative hope that she'd never seen before. "Will you help me? Will you be patient while I learn how to do this?" "Better? Yes," Rebecca said without hesitation. "But you have to promise me something. You have to promise to get professional help." "This is too big for us to fix alone, I promise," Richard said, and Rebecca heard the weight of genuine commitment in his voice. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking the end of one day, and the beginning of something new. Outside, the suburban street was quiet and peaceful, but inside the Matthews house, 30 years of silence had finally been broken by the sound of 2 people choosing healing over hurt, connection over protection, and love over the fear that had kept them apart for far too long. 3 weeks later, Rebecca sat in the waiting room of Dr. Sarah Chen's family therapy practice, her palms slightly damp as she waited for her father to arrive. Through the large windows, Chicago's downtown skyline glittered in the afternoon sun. But her attention was focused on the door, watching for Richard's familiar silhouette. He appeared precisely on time, punctuality being one trait that had served him well in business and, as it turned out, in therapy scheduling. But something about his posture was different. The rigid formality that had always characterized his bearing had softened slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like nervous anticipation. "Rebecca," he said, settling into the chair beside her.
Ow.
"How are you feeling about this?" The question itself was progress. 3 weeks ago, Richard would have approached therapy like a business meeting, focusing on logistics and outcomes rather than emotional states. His willingness to acknowledge her feelings as relevant was a small but significant shift. "Nervous," she admitted, "but hopeful." Dr. Chen emerged from her office with the kind of warm professionalism that immediately put people at ease. Middle-aged, with graying hair and intelligent eyes, she moved with the confident grace of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate their most difficult conversations. "Rebecca, Richard, please come in." The office was designed to feel more like a living room than a clinical space, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, soft lighting, and carefully chosen artwork that suggested peace rather than analysis. Richard looked around with the calculating gaze Rebecca remembered from her childhood, but his expression held curiosity rather than judgment. "Before we begin," Dr. Chen said, settling into her chair with practiced ease, "I want to acknowledge how difficult it can be for families to come together in this setting. Richard, Rebecca tells me this is your first experience with therapy." Richard nodded stiffly. "I've always believed that people should handle their problems privately. And yet you're here," Dr. Chen observed gently. "What changed your mind?" Richard was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap in a gesture Rebecca recognized as his way of buying time to formulate responses. "I realized that handling problems privately wasn't working. My wife died without ever feeling truly understood by me, and my daughter grew up believing she wasn't worthy of my love. Private problem-solving clearly wasn't effective." Rebecca felt a familiar tightness in her chest at her father's matter, a failures of his failures. But underneath the pain was something new, respect for his willingness to own the damage he'd caused. "Rebecca, how does it feel to hear your father say that?" "Affirming," Rebecca said after a pause. "And terrifying. For 3 decades, I convinced myself that the issues between us were somehow my fault. Hearing him admit otherwise it's what I always needed, but it's also frightening. Now I have to figure out how to release all the anger I've held on to." Dr. Chen gave a thoughtful nod. "Anger can be a shield. It often feels safer than exposing your true feelings." "Richard, how do you relate to vulnerability?" Richard's jaw tensed, subtly an old defense against emotional probing. But instead of brushing it off, he paused to reflect. "Vulnerability was risky when I was growing up," he said eventually. "My father treated any kind of emotion as weakness, and weakness was something that got punished. I learned early on that the safest way to survive was to keep everything I truly felt completely hidden." "And how did that affect your marriage?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Richard's voice dropped. "It ruined it. Catherine spent 3 decades trying to connect with me, while I kept her at a distance. She died believing she'd married someone she never really knew." Rebecca observed her father, watching him wrestle with feelings long buried. His expression revealed the effort it took to stay open, to face difficult truths instead of slipping. "Back into old patterns of avoidance, Rebecca?" Dr. Chen said, turning to her. "What do you need from your father to feel safe enough to be emotionally open with him?" The question struck deeper than she expected. What did she truly need? Years of therapy had helped her identify her behavioral loops, but applying that insight to her dynamic with Richard felt like charting unknown territory. "Consistency," she finally replied. "I need to believe that when I share something meaningful, he won't minimize it or turn it into a to-do list. And I need to feel confident he won't emotionally check out when the conversation gets hard." Richard leaned in slightly. "Does emotional checking out look like? I want to understand what I do that feels like abandonment." Rebecca was surprised. This was a kind of engagement her father had never offered before, a before to genuine interest in his effect on her, instead of simply justifying himself. "When I try to talk to you about something that matters," she said, "you shift the topic or leave the room. Or you offer practical advice instead of recognizing what I'm actually feeling. It's like you don't know how to be with emotions when they're raw." Richard nodded slowly. "That's true. Emotions, especially positive ones, feel threatening. To me, when you're excited about something, when you want to share joy, part of me panics because I don't know how to respond in a way that matches. So I default to what's familiar, fixing problems, evaluating results, talking logistics." Dr. Chen leaned in. "Richard, what would it look like for you to sit with Rebecca's feelings without trying to repair or analyze them?" Richard hesitated. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "It feels like asking me to function without oxygen, but I want to try." Over the next 45 minutes, Dr. Chen led them through activities designed to build empathy, validate feelings, and clarify emotional boundaries. Rebecca watched her father struggle through ideas that seemed alien to him, yet he kept trying more intently than she'd ever seen. When Richard responded to one of Rebecca's work frustrations with a simple "that sounds like it really matters to you" instead of jumping in with solutions, she saw how difficult it was for him, but also how committed he was to trying. "This isn't going to be quick," Dr. Chen said as their session ended. "Patterns that took decades to form don't change overnight. Richard, you're learning an entirely new skill set, the language of emotional engagement. And Rebecca, you're learning how to trust that this change isn't just a phase." As they walked to the parking structure, Richard was unusually quiet. Rebecca studied his face for signs of retreat or regret. Instead, she saw something new: quiet. "Reflection. That was more difficult than I thought," Richard said, when they reached their cars. "In what way?" He paused, one hand resting on his car door. Dr. Chen made it clear that good intentions aren't enough. "I can't just will myself into being different. I'd have to learn new techniques, develop new habits. It's like," paused again, searching for the right comparison. "Like learning a foreign language after spending 50 years expecting everyone else to speak yours?" Rebecca let a small smile break through. "That's actually a really good metaphor. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" Richard asked unexpectedly. "Nothing fancy, no agenda, just dinner. Maybe you can tell me about your clients, and I'll try to really listen without jumping in to solve anything." Invitation caught her off guard. It wasn't his usual style. There was no commanding tone, no assumption she'd say yes. It was vulnerable, hopeful. "I'd like that," she said, "but Dad, if you start to feel overwhelmed, if things get too heavy, just say so. Don't shut down or vanish into your office. We can pause or stop, but please don't disappear." Richard gave a solemn nod. "I'll do my best." The following night, Rebecca arrived at the house she'd grown up in to find the dining table arranged in a more relaxed way than she'd ever seen. Gone were the formal place settings and polished silver. He'd used regular dishes, cloth napkins, and lit a pair of plain candles. "I made lasagna," Richard said, sounding almost bashful. "Your mom's recipe. I found it in her old box." Rebecca felt her eyes sting. Her mother's lasagna had been a warm, nostalgic dish, flavorful, hearty, and always served with affection. Richard making it felt like a quiet gesture of reconciliation. "How'd it turn out?" she asked. "Not perfect, but edible. I think I missed some of the nuances." He served her a generous helping, and she could tell he'd tried. Bite wasn't quite right. He was right about the missing touches, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. It tasted like a beginning. "Tell me about your current caseload," Richard said, settling into his chair with visible determination to practice what they'd learned in therapy. Rebecca studied his face, looking for signs of the performative interest he'd shown throughout. Her childhood, the polite attention that lasted exactly as long as social convention required. Instead, she saw genuine curiosity mixed with nervous concentration, like a student preparing for an important exam. "I'm working with a family where the father travels constantly for work," Rebecca began carefully. "The kids are acting out because they feel abandoned, and the mother is overwhelmed, trying to hold everything together alone." She watched Richard's face as she spoke, noting the moment when his expression shifted from active listening to problem-solving mode. His mouth opened slightly, ready to offer practical solutions about travel schedules and childcare arrangements. But then something remarkable happened. Richard caught himself, visibly restraining the impulse to fix the situation. His mouth closed, and he leaned forward slightly, his attention returning to Rebecca's face rather than the logistics of the problem. "That must be frustrating," he said carefully. "For all of them, but especially for you as their counselor." Rebecca felt a surge of pride in her father's effort. "It is frustrating, but also familiar. The dynamics remind me of..." She paused, realizing she was about to make their conversation personal in a way that might trigger Richard's defenses. "Of our family," Richard finished quietly. "A father who was physically present but emotionally absent, a mother trying to bridge the gap, children acting out because they couldn't get their needs met." The insight was so accurate, so emotionally intelligent, that Rebecca stared at her father in surprise. "Yes, exactly. What do you tell families like that? How do you help them?" Rebecca took a sip of wine, buying herself time to consider. Her response. They were venturing into territory that could easily become a minefield if she wasn't careful. I helped them understand that presence and availability are different things, that showing up physically isn't the same as showing up emotionally. And I helped the absent parent understand that their children aren't rejecting them. Personally, they're responding to feeling unseen and unvalued. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing her words with the same intensity he'd once applied to merger negotiations. Is that what happened with us? You weren't rejecting me? You were responding to feeling unseen? I never rejected you, Dad. I spent my entire childhood trying to get your attention, trying to be interesting enough or accomplished enough to earn your focus. When that didn't work, I eventually stopped trying. Richard's face showed the effort. It took to stay present with painful information rather than deflecting or defending. I saw your withdrawal as independence. I told myself you didn't need me anymore, that you were better off without my interference. I always needed you, Rebecca said quietly. I just needed you to show up as my father, not as my performance evaluator. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, with Richard practicing the skills Dr. Chen had taught them. He asked follow-up questions instead of offering solutions. He validated Rebecca's feelings before sharing his own perspective. When he felt overwhelmed by the emotional content, he asked for a brief break rather than shutting down completely. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when his old patterns reasserted themselves, when his discomfort with vulnerability made him retreat into formality. But each time he caught himself and course-corrected, showing Rebecca that change was possible even for someone who had spent decades perfecting emotional avoidance. As Rebecca prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the door with the same careful attention he'd shown all evening. Thank you, he said, being patient while I learn how to do this better. Thank you for learning, Rebecca replied, for caring enough to do the work. Richard nodded, then surprised her by initiating a hug, brief and slightly awkward but genuine. I'll see you at therapy next week? Yes, Rebecca said. And Dad, you did good tonight. Not perfect, but good. She drove home to her hotel. Rebecca felt something shifting inside her chest, not the complete healing of 30 years of wounds, but the beginning of something new. Trust was fragile and would need to be rebuilt slowly. But for the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she and her father were moving in the same direction rather than circling each other in patterns of mutual hurt. That would be difficult and sometimes painful, but tonight had proven that it was possible. Her father was finally learning the language of emotional connection, and she was learning to believe that his efforts were genuine rather than temporary. It wasn't the family she'd always wanted. It might become the family they could build together if they both continued to choose healing over hiding. 6 months later, Becca stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Botanic Garden Pavilion, smoothing the simple lines of her ivory dress. Through the window, she could see David's family arranging flowers and adjusting chairs with the easy teamwork that had always characterized their gatherings. His parents, siblings, aunts, and uncles moved together like a well-rehearsed orchestra, their laughter and gentle teasing creating the kind of warm chaos that had initially overwhelmed Rebecca, but now felt like home. Margaret appeared behind, her in the mirror, carrying a delicate pearl necklace. Your mother would be so proud, she said, fastening the clasp with gentle fingers. Not just of who you've become, but of the courage you've shown these past months. Rebecca touched the pearls Catherine's wedding necklace, which had been waiting in her jewelry box for decades for this moment. Some days I still can't believe we got here. Healing isn't linear, Margaret replied, adjusting Rebecca's veil with practiced hands. But it's possible. You and your father have proven that. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Jennifer's voice called through the wood. Rebecca? Your father is here. Rebecca's stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation. 6 months of weekly therapy sessions had transformed her relationship with Richard from one of careful distance to tentative but genuine connection. He'd learned to ask about her feelings rather than just her achievements. She'd learned to share her thoughts, without expecting immediate judgment, but today felt like a test of how far they'd really come. Send him in, Rebecca called. Richard appeared in the doorway wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but his expression held none of the formal composure that had once defined him. Instead, Rebecca saw something she'd rarely witnessed in her father: genuine emotion mixed with nervous vulnerability. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "Absolutely beautiful." Margaret and Jennifer quietly excused themselves, sensing that father and daughter needed these moments alone. Richard stepped into the room, his movements careful as if he were approaching something precious that might break. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and Rebecca smiled at the question that had become his standard greeting since beginning therapy. Deliberate practice of prioritizing emotional connection over practical concerns. Nervous, happy, grateful. Rebecca turned to face him fully. "Dad, are you okay? You look like you're about to cry." Richard's laugh was shaky. "I might be. 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost you forever. The fact that you're letting me walk you down the aisle feels like a gift I don't deserve." "You do deserve it," Rebecca said firmly. "Not because you're perfect, but because you did the work, because you chose to change rather than staying. Stuck in patterns that were hurting us both." Richard nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you, something I should have given you years ago." He withdrew a small velvet box, not the size for a ring, but clearly containing something significant. Rebecca opened it to find a delicate gold locket she'd never seen. "Before it was your grandmother's," Richard explained. "My mother's? She died when I was 12, and I've kept this hidden away because it reminded me of everything I lost. But you should have it. You should carry something with you that represents love rather than loss." Rebecca lifted the locket from its velvet nest, noting the intricate engraving on its surface. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and Rebecca's own smile. "She looks like you," Richard said quietly. "And like you, she had the ability to find joy in small moments, to make other people feel valued and loved. I wish you could have known her." Rebecca felt tears starting, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "Help me put it on." Richard's hands were slightly unsteady as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck, the locket settling just above her heart. "There's something else," he said. "Something I need to tell you before we walk out there." Rebecca waited, noting the way her father was struggling to find words for something important. "I spoke to your grandfather last week," Richard said finally. "I went to see him." Rebecca's breath caught. "You did? How did it go?" "About well, as you'd expect. He's still cruel, still manipulative, still proud of the damage he caused." Richard's voice was steady, but Rebecca could see the cost of that visit in his eyes. "But I needed to face him. I needed to look at him and choose to be different." "What did you tell him?" Richard's smile was sad but resolute. "I told him that his legacy of cruelty ends with me, that my daughter will know she's loved without conditions, that my future grandchildren will grow up feeling valued for who they are rather than what they achieve. I told him that he failed to break me completely and that his failure freed me to choose love over fear." Rebecca felt her heart swell with pride for the man her father had chosen to become. "How did he respond?" He laughed, called me weak and sentimental. "Predicted that I'd fail at being a loving father, just like I failed at being a good son." Richard's voice grew stronger, but his words don't have power over me anymore. I know who I am now, and I know who I want to be. Rebecca reached for her father's hand, squeezing his fingers with gentle pressure. "I'm proud of you, for facing him, for choosing differently, for doing the work even when it was terrifying." "I'm proud of you too," Richard said, "for giving me the chance to learn how to love you properly, for not giving up on us when it would have been easier to walk away." Through the window, Rebecca could see David talking with his parents near the altar, his face bright with anticipation. The contrast between his easy family relationships and the careful reconstruction she and Richard had undertaken was stark. But it no longer felt like a judgment, but different families healed in different ways, and there was beauty in choosing to build something new from the wreckage of old patterns. "Are you ready?" Richard asked, offering his arm with a formality that somehow felt ceremonial rather than distant. "I'm ready," Rebecca said, looping her arm through his. They walked through the garden pavilion together, past rows of friends and family who had gathered to witness at not just a wedding, but a celebration of love in all its forms. David's relatives beamed with the easy joy of people accustomed to happy endings, while Margaret and Jennifer watched with the deeper satisfaction of witnesses to hard-won healing. As they reached the altar, David turned to face them, his smile bright enough to outshine the afternoon sun. Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion, not the fantasy perfection she'd dreamed of as a child, but something better. The real and imperfect beauty of people choosing to love each other despite and because of their wounds. Rebecca's hand in David's with careful ceremony, but instead of immediately stepping back, he surprised everyone by speaking. "David," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the pavilion, "I'm giving you the most precious thing in my life. Not as property to be transferred, but as a woman who deserves to be cherished exactly as she is. Promise me you'll never make her question her worth." "I promise," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. Richard nodded, then turned to Rebecca, "And I promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you were always family material. It's the best kind." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as her father stepped back, his own eyes bright with unshed emotion. The ceremony that followed was beautiful, David's vows about building a life based on mutual respect and unconditional love. Promises about choosing partnership over perfection and healing over hiding. But it was Richard's unexpected speech during the reception that brought the strongest emotions. Standing before the gathered guests with hands that shook only slightly, he spoke about second chances and the courage required to break generational patterns. "My daughter has taught me that it's never too late to learn how to love properly," he said, his gaze finding Rebecca in the crowd. "She's shown me that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choosing to show up for each other even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." He raised his glass, his voice growing stronger. "To Rebecca and David, we're starting their marriage with the emotional intelligence and communication skills that took me 50 years to develop. May you always remember that the strongest families are built not on perfection, but on the willingness to do better tomorrow than you did today." The applause was thunderous, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was too focused on her father's face, seeing in his expression the man he'd become rather than the one he'd always been. Not perfect, not completely healed, but genuinely present and working toward something better every day. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Rebecca found herself standing with Richard on the pavilion's terrace, watching David's family clean up with their characteristic teamwork and laughter. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, quietly, choosing to change rather than staying comfortable in familiar patterns. Richard considered the question seriously. "Sometimes the work is exhausting. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of keeping everyone at arm's length. But then I look at you and David, at the life you're building together, and I realize that comfort isn't the same as happiness. I may have learned how to love properly later than I should have, but I learned that has to count for something." Rebecca leaned against her father's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence without the rigid tension that had once characterized his physical proximity. "Counts for everything." Above them, stars were becoming visible in the deepening sky, and Rebecca thought about cycles, how some were destructive and needed to be broken, while others were beautiful and worth preserving. Her marriage to David would create new patterns based on emotional honesty rather than fear, on connection rather than control. The cycle of emotional cruelty that had begun with Thomas Matthews was finally ending. In its place, Rebecca and David were beginning something new, a family built on the foundation of love, freely given rather than carefully earned, presence rather than performance, and the radical belief that people could change if they had the courage to do the work. As her father walked her to the car where David was waiting, Rebecca realized that she'd gotten everything she'd always wanted, just not in the way she'd expected. Her childhood dream of a father who loved her unconditionally had been replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more valuable. A father who had learned to love her consciously, deliberately, and with full awareness of what that love required. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd once imagined, but it was real and hard-won and beautiful in its imperfection.
Ow!
And as she and David drove away toward their honeymoon and their new life together, Rebecca carried with her the knowledge that healing was possible, that patterns could be broken, that the most profound love stories weren't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to become better people for the sake of those we love. The grandfather clock in the Matthews house would continue to mark time, but it would no longer count the hours of misconnection and unspoken love. Instead, it would measure the moments of a family learning to heal, one honest conversation at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.